Hello friends, my name is Marines and this is the start of a new series. It is essentially an author deep dive. I will be reading Victoria Schwab's V.E. Schwab's entire body of work and doing a review for each book or series, and then just talking about their work and patterns in their work as a whole. I decided to do this with V.E. Schwab specifically because they are a very popular author that I have had a lot of trouble with the work of theirs that I have actually read, and in like that small sampling of their work, I started to notice a few things that felt like they were repeating patterns, and I wanted to see if what I had noticed was true. So up to this point, I had read Vicious, A Darker Shade of Magic, and The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. So in addition to reading each book or series, I will be paying attention to two main things. One, I kind of want to answer the question for myself of what it is exactly about her work that doesn't work for me, because it works for so many people, and there's just always something about her work that just hasn't quite worked for me, but I want to put my finger on it. I want to be able to say, like, this is what Victoria Schwab does that does not work for me. And two, I really want to take a look at the portrayal of women within her work, because in those three books of hers that I have read, it really tend to focus on a female character that was like not like other girls. The purpose of this project is definitely not to simplify gender or the expressions of gender or to subscribe to any ideas about traditional femininity, and I'm certainly not going to read into Schwab's intent, and I'm certainly not going to imply anything about their own experiences of gender. So I want to look at not intent, but impact, and the way that some of these characters in that small sampling felt to me like a lot of internalized misogyny kind of packed into a character, and the way that they fit into that trope of like not like other girls. So those are the two main things that I kind of have in mind as I'm starting this project, but I'm sure that as I read more and more of their work, I will be able to notice more patterns and draw more conclusions. I believe I will be reading all of her books in publishing order. I announced the start of this project, or the idea of this project, back in like February or March on TikTok, and at that point I was already reading the first book, her debut novel, The Near Witch, and it took me several months just to get through it. So that's your first indication of how this project started. And it was not great. It took me a while to read it, and then after I read it, I was like struggling a little bit with like what to do with this. Even though I've read some of Schwab's work already, I am a little bit removed from those experiences, and I feel like I'm starting with a specific project in mind with like this first data point. So I wasn't sure if I should like read one more and like group a couple of reviews together. So it took me some time to like work it all through in my head, and then at that point I kind of had like wiped a lot of the details of The Near Witch from my mind, so I actually reread it. And here we are. The Near Witch is a young adult fantasy that was published originally in August of 2011. It is about a village named Near, and this is a place where there are never any strangers that visit. It has two witches that sort of live on the edge of the village, and then one day a stranger appears in the village and children begin to suddenly disappear. So everyone in the village thinks that the stranger is responsible. Lexi is our main character, and she is interested in investigating what is actually going on. She doesn't believe that the stranger is responsible, and so she takes it into her own hands to figure out what is happening with the children in this village. The first thing that I will say about this is like the greatest weakness of the story, and it is also something that I immediately was like, oh, I feel like I remember this from other Schwab works, and it is that the pacing was not very good. The beginning in general was so painfully slow, and I feel like I felt that about Addie LaRue, and I definitely felt that about Vicious. So there is something about the pacing of Schwab's books, the ones that I've read so far, where she just is dragging out that beginning, and then the end sort of feels like a sloppy rush to the finish. And that was certainly the case here. Like I said, it took me months to read this, and it was under 300 pages, but I just could not motivate myself to pick this up because the pace was honestly like molasses. It was moving so slowly. We were getting nowhere. Honestly, there was like nowhere to get to, and by the time we get to the end and everything is speeding by, and the end to me felt really telegraphed and obvious as well, it just didn't feel like a payoff for the amount of time that we just spent absolutely spinning our wheels in this plot. The story itself, published in 2011, as I said, feels a little bit dated in a way. It feels very derivative. It had the flavor of the kinds of like YA fantasies that were coming out in 2011 and 2012 that were taking a lot of inspiration from like the Hunger Games and things along those lines. I was really struck at the beginning of this how much like the setup just felt very Hunger Games-esque, because you have our main character who is not like other girls because she is a hunter and she's not interested in like what the village girls are interested in. She was taught to be a hunter and her tracker by her father, and her father is dead. Her mother, in her like depression over the father's death, is withdrawn from the family and is sort of helping to provide for them, but in a very removed way, in a very inactive way. And then there is a little sister who is cute and innocent and who the main character loves very much. So like very, very close, not only in setup, but in sort of those initial opening beats, like very close. And apart from like the very specific comparisons at the beginning, because then the story kind of goes its own way, it also just like in general felt like very just like generic YA fantasy. A lot of the naming conventions were incredibly on the nose and generic, and there was nothing fresh here at all. I don't feel like this had anything to say. I don't feel like, I don't know, there wasn't anything here that will stick out in my memory, as evidenced by the fact that I read this year and a few months passed and I literally had to reread it in order to do like any semblance of a detailed review, because it just honestly gone from my brain pan, because the details, like, they don't matter. They're barely there. What you would expect from a story like this that is very plot light and is focusing a lot on sort of atmosphere and almost like a fairy tale vibe is that it would have a character focus then, right? If you're not going to drive the story forward with your plot at all, then you need some sort of investment in the characters. And I felt that the characters here were incredibly flat. Like, I can tell you a couple things about the main character, Lexi, and they are mostly like, she's a hunter. Her dad is dead, and like that's kind of it. But don't ask me to tell you like a single stinking thing about any other character. There were characters that you sort of got the sense were standing in for, I don't know, types or behaviors. So like a lot of the men in the village are very misogynistic and they're like, we man, we protect, or whatever. But you don't get a sense of like motivation for any of this. Like, there isn't any depth there at all. And I don't even need this to be like the next great American novel, right? I don't need this to be like a thesis on toxic masculinity in small town. Like, none of, just a little bit of something of substance to drive the story. Like, that's all I needed was some reason to invest here and to keep reading. And again, it wasn't in the plot. And then there was like nothing here in terms of the characters either. In terms of the female characters that are actually portrayed, we do have the main female character, Lexi. I've kind of already alluded to her being something of a not like other girls because she's a hunter. She's not interested in sort of what the other village girls are interested in. I don't think that this one is as overt as some other examples that we will see later in Schwab's work, but the flavor is there, because you get these very explicit lines of, I'd rather stay here and deliver my mother's bread, rather grow old and crooked like Magda and Dreska Thorn than be bound up in skirts and slippers and married off to a village boy. So it's got that flavor. I think that what is missing here to be like a very overt, not like other girls thing is like putting down other girls, or sort of that comparison. And honestly, the reason I think that that doesn't fully exist here is that she barely interacts with other girls. There's like one scene where she is surrounded by the village women, and because the children have gone missing, they're all kind of sort of sitting together and mourning and commiserating, but they're shown as incredibly passive. Like, there's no true interaction with the women there. So because there isn't a lot of that comparison comparison where she's necessarily putting down other women's choices. It doesn't feel like a fully fleshed out Not Like Other Girls. There is also an attempt here, because we do have these men who are the village elders who are very set in sort of their traditional like roles and like their toxic masculinity. There is an attempt to sort of challenge that through Lexi, because she wants to help, she wants to hunt, she wants to keep her father's memory alive and do what she's good at. But again, it is very shallow and superficial, because you don't build these characters out, and especially because you don't build the main character out or give us sort of any other like positive representation of women or her interacting with them. It feels a little hollow. We do have the mother, who is mostly useless through this. She is dealing with her own sadness over her husband's passing, so it's like an understandable thing, just like Katniss's mother. There are a couple of moments where the mom comes in to help and to help Lexi like do her thing, but in really weird like, ma'am, why don't you do more? Like, what are you doing here sorts of ways. So it wasn't a character that I would say I enjoyed or that I thought was particularly well done. And then we have the little sister, who is 5 years old and is just here to be like cute and precocious and in danger of being kidnapped. There are no other real qualities there, very little dialogue from her at all. So again, nothing much to say. And then we do have the witches, and they are witches, so they're portrayed as being creepy and eerie and misunderstood, but also their bodies are often described as like warped and disfigured in a way that uses a lot of like ableism almost to convey sort of like being disfigured as like evil or weird or outcast or things along those lines. Something that is super, super common in fantasy, but also not great, to say the least, to put it lightly. Very surprising to me, considering all of the pieces of this that I've already mentioned. This does have a romance in it, and I absolutely do not know why for. Like the story, I mean, I was just gonna say the story didn't need it, but if the story didn't have the romance, it would have been even more nothing than it was. So the space that it had could support a romance. It was just poorly done. So the stranger who comes into town is a young man, and our main character Lexi sees him like haunting the moors, being creepy out in the dark, and she just kind of decides that he's innocent. Like, he shows up and kids start disappearing, and she's like, it couldn't be him, for no logical reason. Nobody is doing anything for any logical reasons in this whole thing, which would have been fine if it didn't also ask us to believe that they were like falling in love. The character is also like very mysterious. He doesn't talk a lot. He's not giving a lot. So the fact that it was like insta love from a character who's not even giving anything, he barely speaks, and also he's like suspected of child kidnapping. There were so many elements of this that I was just like, what is happening? And also like, why? And the why is that it felt like obligatory, right? A YA fantasy, you gotta put a romance in there, but it just did not work for me on any level. The writing here expected to be like, oh, this is like early Schwab, right? It's a debut. So I expected to see like a less mature version of her writing, but what I found was like just Schwab's writing. There was something here that like every once in a while there would be a line or a moment that was really beautiful and well described. There were like patches here of creating something that was very eerie and atmospheric, and the moor as a setting like occasionally worked. But then like every other time you had something that was so overwrought that it made me like roll my eyes, like just need to take a whole break to like roll my eyes and recover. And then also there was a ton of repetitiveness. Like it did everything at one step too far. Like the atmospheric vibes it was going for, it became over described and too repetitive. Like the number of times that we heard something was dark or gray or night or pale against the night, it was the same descriptions over and over and over again. And it felt like even though the moor is an incredibly important setting here, like we were checking in with the moor entirely way too much. Like we would get a point of action and then the moor was doing this, and then a bit of dialogue and the moor is still here in the background and it's, you know, dark and gray. It was too much. And it became even more obvious in a story that had little to no plot. And the plot that it did have was so nonsensical. It was just like everybody was running around. Nobody was actually investigating in any way that made any sense. People were just jumping to conclusions. And not only because they were like, I don't know, xenophobic, but like just like in weird ways where it's like, children are being kidnapped, but nobody's gonna like patrol. Things that where I was just like, I don't actually understand what's happening here. And then also you're just going to be repetitive on top of it. So repetitive like in language, but also in just like the things that were happening. The number of times that like Lexi was like, I'm going to investigate. And her uncle was like, no, you're a girl and you gotta stay safe. And she would sneak out and like go talk to the witches or talk to the boy or whatever. But then she would like have to rush home and go to sleep. We heard about her falling asleep so many times, and then she would wake up the next morning and her uncle was in the kitchen and she'd be like, I'm gonna investigate. And he was like, still a girl. This happened so many times, even in the climax where we were like, oh my gosh, like a witch and bones and magic and creepy things. She would just stop and be like, time to go home and sleep. And we would have to read about her falling asleep again. I honestly, I was like, what are we doing? Why is this happening? I have no answers for you as to why this was happening, but I can say that I did not enjoy like any of this. I rated this 2 stars when I finished it, probably because it did have some of those moments that did feel like well written, well described, and it was atmospheric in points. But like sitting here and talking about it really cements like how much I did not enjoy this. Rereading also cemented like all of these things as problems for me. Sometimes in first reads, like I can feel like maybe it was just me, but rereading it, I'm like, no. It's here in the text. So probably I would actually give this like 1.5 out of 5 stars. Not a super promising start. The next book up is The Archived, which was published on January 23rd, 2013. So just a couple years after her debut. I heard goodish things about this. I feel like this had a little bit of a moment on BookTube where people were like, no, this one is good actually. So my hopes are a little bit high. I mean, I am hoping to at least like The Archived better than The Near Witch. I would love to chat with you guys about this book, but also about this project. If you have experience reading Schwab's work, please let me know what you think of their work and what you think I should expect moving through their work. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you guys soon. The like birds, every single garbage truck in the history of this city has like gone by. There were these birds are driving me crazy.